Okay.
I think we
Looks
are
like
live.
we're going. Okay, I'll kick things off. Welcome everybody to this monthly community meeting of creating the future. We usually kick off our meetings by starting with quick introductions and then also sharing what's been awesome for us or our organizations or both for the last month. So does anybody want to kick it off? Kick that off. Hildy, how about you?
Sure, I will happily kick it off. I'm Hilda Gottlieb. I'm in Tucson, Arizona, where right now it is completely clear blue sky. This morning when I got up, it was completely clouded and a little bit of rain. Now it's completely clear blue, and they say it's going to rain again, so who knows? I have two things that are sort of bearing on me as awesome. One of them is awesome in the, not the great awesome, but in the stuff of life awesome, which is, I don't know if any of you knew John Hayden. John was a social media guru, marketing guru, one of the kindest, most beautiful humans I've ever met. And he passed away this weekend. He was struggling with, not really struggling with, fighting tooth and nail against cancer for about 2 years. And did it in a way that built community around him. He, for somebody who was always, he was about social media. He was about what that meant, what the connection meant. And so as soon as he got the diagnosis, he formed a Facebook group. And it was called Watch John Beat Cancer. And he was very clear that beating cancer didn't mean, he was a very devout Buddhist. And he was very clear that it didn't mean that you don't die, that the cancer doesn't, but that the cancer doesn't get your soul. And it was really an honor to walk alongside him in that journey with everyone else who was in the group. And so it was a very bittersweet, a very awesome, in the harshest and most life-affecting way this weekend as he passed, and watching everybody come together around that. That he had formed community and connected people to each other, which was pretty meaningful. I learned a lot from watching that. I learned about what it is to be a human, which was pretty awesome in the most deepest sense of the word. And then the other awesome that has been truly bearing on my soul for the past several days is I am reading the most remarkable book. It is called The Death and Life of Aida Hernandez. I don't know if any of you've heard of it. It is the story of the US-Mexico border told through the through line of this 22-year-old girl who was born, and it's very close to home. It is about an hour and a half from here. She was born on the Mexico side of the line, and her mom brought her here to the US side of the line, and we're talking just the line, to the US side when she was about 8. So she would have been a dreamer. And it's just this most powerful, I can't recommend it enough. I am telling everybody about it. I am taking pictures of paragraphs and posting them everywhere. It starts even 50 years ago, back in the 60s, during the land reforms and revolts in Mexico, clear up through the history of the border, through insights into what it is like to be in lockup, to be in, and you see her life, because it is the story of her life. I can't stop reading this thing. And you really, unlike fiction where it's going to end happy, you have no idea how it's going to end. And I'm just, I'm sneaking reading. This is one of those, I'm actually like almost under the covers with flashlight sneaking reading, So yeah, it's been a sort of emotionally powerful several days. So that's my
thank you for
awesome.
thank you for sharing
Yeah.
those. Hey, who wants to go next?
I'll go. So I'm Justin Pollack. I'm Washington, D.C. And my awesome is I literally just watched Hair Love, which was just incredible. It's only 6 minutes, so
Right.
if anyone's feeling like they don't have enough time, just a beautiful short. So I'm on the high of that. And then I got this great book by this author Angie Eikenberry came in.
Yes.
And I got this blog post this morning from someone named Boo Lee. And someone named Hildy last week told me she was going to take sabbatical to do some writing. And now I'm feeling really anxious because my last blog post was June of last year. So, so feeling inspired to write.
Yes.
Catch up with some of y'all.
I love when you write, and as a father of girls, you must have loved. Hair Love. Awesome.
Yeah.
Oh, I have to watch that.
They're all going to be watching it when they get home from school.
Very cool.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing those. Which one of you wants to go next?
I'll go. Hey everyone. Oh, by the way, Justin, writing is all like going to the gym. You just gotta do it, and as you do it, it gets better and easier. At least theoretically, because I've never been to a gym before. My awesome is that I planted about 100 tulip bulbs in the fall, like months ago, and I am not a gardener, and now they're starting to sprout up. I was so afraid that the winter would kill them, and now they're starting, and every day I get really excited because they grow just 1 millimeter more, and it's really amazing.
That is amazing. Yeah, spring's coming.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dimitri.
Yes.
I'm gonna switch over.
All right. Hello, everyone. Dimitri Petropoulos. I am also in Tucson, Arizona. This is a very soulful, awesome session here. I've been sort of reflecting on a couple of things and wanted to key off one thing that Vu said in terms of garden. We've had a garden that I got planted here, and Hildy sort of loves gardening and really took the yeoman's effort, the yeowoman's effort in getting it planted and getting it going. And watching this cold snap, that couple of them that have come through where it was below freezing. And for us, that's maybe happens a couple times a year, but the scramble to cover everything and, came up with setting up little Christmas lights all throughout the inside of the garden. And hopefully that little bit of heat would keep them from freezing. So 2 days ago, we pulled all the sheets, which by the way, Goodwill had at 99 cents specifically for covering gardens. So we got like a bucket load of those. And everything was fine. And so that was great. And awesome. I made a big, huge salad last night and it was all garden stuff. So it was like, wow, that was really amazing. The other thing that is sort of the soulful thing, Hilda, you were talking about the border story, and I'm looking forward to reading that soon. But I don't know if you guys have seen in the news, there have been stories about what's been going on the border in terms of the wall and how on the western border of Arizona, or not totally on the western border, but south of here, they're literally blasting through the national forest, blasting mountains in order to put the wall in. And this is a section of Arizona that has the indigenous people, the Tohono O'odham, who basically their land had extended into what is artificially called Mexico. And so they have religious sites, they have pilgrimages, they go back and forth, and And this is really, in addition to the environment, the animals, it's just painful looking at photographs of this and just seeing what's happening to an area that we've been to many times. So that's sort of the more, coming to grips with reality. Awesome. That some of this is really going on. So.
Yeah, wow. Thank you for sharing that and reminding us about that happening. Yeah, it's easy to, I see the headlines, but like to make it real, it's like, yeah, it's real. A lot of real suffering going on in a lot of different places. But what my awesome maybe is to, actually, on the book theme, I just got done, I'm listening to reading several books for a class I'm teaching. And one of them is the Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, which if you haven't read yet is a really good and important book to read. And also The Warmth of Other Suns, which about the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to the North. And well, both the books are amazing and really well written, but also like bring, totally different perspectives than what we're kind of, sort of the white framed history that we end up being exposed to in schools and so on, and media and et cetera, et cetera. So that's been really awesome experience for reading those, and I'll be talking about them with students in my class pretty soon. So I'm looking forward to that. And the other final awesome thing about the book, so Justin, I sent a book to Justin of the reframing book. I went to the post office or to the UPS office actually to mail a copy to Carl too. And guess how much it was going to cost for me to mail it to the UK? They told me it was going to cost $170. Yeah, so I said, I'm just going to go. I actually am just going to fly to England and take the book then for that. And then that actually a few days later, I got an invitation to come to give a keynote at a conference in September in England. So I'm going to bring the book. He doesn't know it yet, but yeah. Anyway, it's kind of funny. I'm like, what? It costs that much to mail a book?
Wow. Angie, when you
It's
get
crazy.
a moment, could you put the titles and the authors in the chat box so that we have them?
Yes, I will do that.
Yeah.
Okay, actually, I can send you the whole syllabus. There's a lot of interesting books that we're also, other book we're reading. Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff. Okay, anybody else want to add anything to our introductions or awesomes before we get going on to sort of businessy stuff?
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh.
Lost Boo?
We'll maybe wait a couple seconds to see if he's back. So you guys all got the agenda that I hopefully, sorry that it was kind of last minute. And I tried to take a stab at, first of all, kind of summarizing very briefly where I think we ended up last meeting. And so I want to just touch on that a little bit and then get into some discussion around bylaws / bylaws and kind of where it looks like the discussion had been previously, connecting all those dots together to get us then to maybe talking about sort of creating the conditions for success around these, getting to a product of some, or rewrite of some bylaws. So, just to recap from last meeting, the main takeaways for me, and please jump in as well, is I think that we came to a consensus in our discussion around the idea that, kind of building on all that discussion we had about the board and what's the role of the board, is that the board is actually everyone who's involved in the organization, or we don't really need to separate out the board from the staff and the key volunteers. So, if the board or whatever we call that group is everyone, then we started to talk about working towards creating or recreating or rewriting bylaws that reflect this and this kind of idea of shared governance, and making decisions using catalytic thinking as being key to that. And we left the meeting with the goal of starting to work towards redrafting those bylaws or bylaws, as you guys have had previous discussions around that. So does that kind of capture in a very brief nutshell what we talked about last meeting, or does anybody else want to add anything to that?
I think it's great.
I think I would just add, Angie, and thank you for doing that and the agenda, by the way. Just for grounding folks who, haven't been tracking all of this, it really isn't re-envisions, as you were saying, the notion of what a board is. I think we sort of all agreed that the current constructs and things don't serve us well. So to re-envision that and, is what we're after.
Right, and the bylaws kind of help us to kind of codify that in a way, right?
Yeah.
And then the other processes of the organization, or at least the idea that I understand around bylaws is they're kind of helping to communicate how the organization in a very basic way functions or operates. And so obviously this decision-making group or decision-making collective is an important part of that. Anything else anybody else wants to add?
My brain's already skipping forward. So I'm like,
All right, cool. Then let's get into so getting into this bylaws / bylaws or whatever we want to call it. Official legally, they're called bylaws. Yes.
Yeah.
So I looked back at some of the previous notes a bit, but I wasn't a part of all of the conversations of the bylaws previously. So my takeaways from that, kind of looking at, I didn't go back and re-listen to all the meetings. I didn't have time to do, but I looked at the notes and so on. And my main takeaways from those previous discussions about the bylaws that happened before we kind of got into the board, what is a board discussions. The takeaways from those meetings were that the bylaws could help to codify the fact that the leadership and decision making is distributed fractally throughout every part of the organization, so that at every point the same values and questions are guiding the decisions. So the bylaws could potentially just simply state that catalytic thinking framework is our structure. And there was another kind of takeaway from those discussions that we could potentially just have a one-page set of bylaws that kind of articulate our values and the decision-making process. So that was kind of revelatory for me in a way, but I think that there was probably other discussion because the bylaws, Justin, that you put together looked like they were getting into a much more extensive kind of outline. And so I wondered if you maybe could add to that summary of how that came about. And it seems to me we kind of have this, could go one way with one pager versus a much more extensive document.
Yeah, so I think, I updated that a little bit. I think when that first started, it really was trying to take what was sort of a standard set of bylaws and re-envisioning them rather than as a prescriptive document, as a process document. And I think that so really was actually trying to react to what normally shows up in a set of bylaws. And I think at the thinking at that point, and there's still a little bit of it for me now, is we do want to meet people where they are in terms of what. How do we step people into this notion of thinking about things a little bit differently, as opposed to just putting something in front of them that's totally foreign that they don't even know how to interact with. But I did in reflection, as I went through that, one, I realized how much legal crap, or not
Yeah.
it's not even, it's actually, it's not legal stuff, is organizational structure dictate. Like, it's just clarifying things that people want to understand about the corporate structure that aren't even process things or decision making things. They are just declarative, this is the way it is. And as I went through that, one, realizing how much of it was that, I was going back to Vu's comment in the last meeting of, you know, the one page, like, how do we simplify this? And my first response was, oh my gosh, we can't, because there's so much of this declarative stuff in it. And so the thought I had actually was, well, why can't we take the declarative stuff actually out of there? Create our own sort of organizational structure document that sort of addresses all those, you know, we talked about them as legal, they're organizational mechanics. Well, they're not even mechanics, they're declarations. You know, where is the corporation? What's the fiscal year? Like, all of these things, it's almost like we separate those out and have that as a reference document. And then the bylaws as a process piece, I think, sort of, when I had that epiphany, I was like, oh, that's how we do the one page. And as actually you were talking, I was thinking about, you know, one page that gives a framing about how decisions are made, and then probably just identifying the realms within which you would be making these kinds of decisions. Like, so rather than trying to call them all out, so highlighting some things like, you know, you have to make a determination around board terms. You have to, like, these things that aren't dictated by law anywhere, but people are expected a declaration about somewhere as a process. Rather than actually saying how to do it, we would just say, here's catalytic thinking. Here are the realms that you would do it in, and maybe just have a single example. Yeah, actually in the document itself, having something that shows, here's how we determine this for creating the future. With sort of the big asterisk saying that what we arrived on today is not what we would arrive on tomorrow is the answer. Like, that's the thing that's really struck me the most. Like, that question, you know, how many board members you should have. And it's like, as many as you need at the point in time that you have a question about how many board members we should have. Like, it's like, you know, that's going to be really different if, and I always think about organizational cycles. Like, if you're a startup nonprofit, you might want a big cadre of people because they are the organization. When you get more structure, you might say, we're, you know, 3.
And what that's bringing up for me, Justin, just as you're saying it, is that what is, we can just say, legally, we need to have a minimum of 1 board member. We will always have a minimum of 3 board members. And from there, it could be whatever we want. I love what you're saying. I just wanted to, I'm sorry for interrupting. I just got really excited about what you were saying.
Yeah, I mean, legally, by the IRS expects a minimum of 3. That's all it's, I mean, this is what blew my mind when I was looking at, like, we don't actually, the IRS and the Arizona don't say what has to be in the bylaws. We could do anything.
I literally have more gray hair because of this. Like, I have literally been, I mean, I have, you know, Hildy and I have talked to people, but I've done my own searches, like trying to figure out where in the world does anyone say declaratively, this is legally what board members should do. And there's nothing. It's all the euphemism of duty of care.
Right.
Which I know has all sorts of legal interpretations, but there's like there's no regulatory structure that says, like, you're supposed to do this. And I'm, you know, it's kind of like, I'm the type of person where I'm like, I keep doing this and I keep getting no answer. That must mean either there's a conspiracy to hide truth, or there just isn't an answer. Like, we've just evolved into a construct that is just generally accepted. There's nothing more than at some point someone said, I like this idea of duty of care.
Right.
Sounds catchy. You know? But anyway, sort of where I was going with that was I do feel like, and this is what, when I was going through that document again that I was roughly drafting, I do feel like there's something that we have to give some structure to again, so when people look at it, they understand what this is trying to address with the bylaws, and to be able to say, we applied, we apply this, this is how we apply it, this is whom, to your point, Angie, it's not always the board, it's the, or, anyone, I mean, I always think about it, who has decision-making authority over resources. And it's like, again, if we're not just doing it for creating the future, but if we're setting an example too, it's like your office manager is one of your biggest fiduciaries. Like they decide who to buy stuff from. Like when you're talking about, good use of resources, like or values-based, I mean, we talk about this, like, the office manager who decides I'm going to buy it from, Jane's stationery store instead of Staples or Amazon, that's significant. And we don't, so something I think that just frames like a description of the types of decisions we're talking about for the organization. Again, it's going to require, I think, some framing around what catalytic thinking and decision-making looks like in practice in that realm. And then probably a few call outs again of like, here are the important realms within which we think this needs to be applied. Sort of not limited to, but, and that sort of gives us the on-ramp, or that gives us the interface with people who are expecting to see something that says, how many board members are you going to have? It's a process of, getting rid of them, of nominating them. We don't have to describe it, but we just have to say, we use this process in consideration of how we orient, how we nominate, how we boot off. But even though there's not really anything to boot off of.
Right. So one of the questions that
what
go ahead.
makes me think, and I think this is a really, really good way to think about this, is the dynamic nature of that addendum side document, the explanatory document, because as creating the future grows in terms of this hub node network, and examples arise of how catalytic thinking applies, those examples can be added to this document, can be added to this addendum, so that it clarifies further and helps elucidate to people who come upon this. The thing that I always think about with bylaws is, it is sort of the calling card of an organization. They're all sort of the same. So you pick up the business card and you look at it. It's got the name and the phone number and all the other things on it, and you expect that. So I think there is an importance to having something that's expected under the bylaws for people who are looking at it, but also something that allows this one pager, which is so powerful, to make sense to people at all different levels, be they governmental people, be they someone in their neighborhood, be they whomever who come across this, that they understand, oh, that's what you mean, or that's how you would use this, or that's whatever, but allows that to be dynamic, where the catalytic thinking remains not static, but remains sort of the guiding principle.
Yeah, what that's bringing up for me is the question of, and again, we had talked about this when we talked about being an integrity board, of meeting people's expectations. What are people's expectations when they look at bylaws? What are they coming to find out? What are the questions that the bylaws need to answer for those people who are looking at them? And I was smiling at your comments, Justin, about the location of the organization and the fiscal year and stuff. I love the fact that in my speaking contract, for instance, the the location and the number of people and the blah, 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 that's at the top of the contract in bullet points. And yet the location of the organization could take up an entire paragraph when it could say location, Tucson, Arizona, you know, I mean, it's like fiscal year, I mean, it could take up this much space and it'll take up an entire page. And so I was laughing when you were talking, but I guess the question that's sort of ruminating in my mind is what do people actually want to know when they're coming to bylaws? Who gets to decide what is basically what I see. And if all of the decisions that are made, regardless of who's making them, are made using catalytic decision-making, catalytic thinking. And if, as we had said, in this sort of ecosystem that we're building, that the people closest to an issue will make the decisions about that issue, it seems like a one-pager could work very, very nicely.
This is actually a question for you. So, because, you know, Hildy, you said, you know, going to read the bylaws, and it sort of perked to mind, who really does read bylaws? And I'm just curious, in your experience with Rainier Valley Corps, and, you know, because you actively were getting, you know, people to serve on the board that were coming from different perspectives. It's like, did people ever ask about the bylaws or read the bylaws? Or
No, people never really do. I think we only use the bylaws when there's some legal issues. And we send them as part of the board orientation package. And at the same time, I don't know, we only look at them when officers are being elected. And we're like, oh, is it time to elect officers? What does our bylaws say? Yeah, I don't know. I think going with what Hildy says, which is, you know, there's like the bylaws, and there's like the, you know, like the actual, I don't know, like a manual of what we actually do, which might be more helpful. I don't know. The bylaws are so formal and legalese that they are completely useless most of the time, except for legal matters. So I don't know. I am in recommendation. I agree with this simplifying it and saying, you know, a board will have between 3 to infinity board members. We'll meet wherever the board decides we'll meet, and we'll be located wherever the board decides we'll be located.
So it seems to me, sorry, go ahead.
well, just because it's in my head, and in the context of this is, I'm preparing for a racial justice facilitation, and I'm doing something for Black History Month in my daughter's school, and I'm, you know, everything that I'm reading about bias, I'm just wondering if we need to be intentional about how we check bias, just because, to Louie's point around, we want to set up for a lot of discretion to work through, but we also want to make sure that it's a system that doesn't perpetuate problems because we get groupthink. And so, and I know catalytic thinking has mechanisms to catch that, but we may also want to, you know, be, you know, I mean, in some ways, catalytic thinking is actually can be agnostic around that, because if you infuse, you know, like we said, it could be used for bad, it can be used for good. And so it just strikes me that, you know, we talk about it from the legal standpoint, but is there something also from the social standpoint in terms of equity and just that we need to make sure that if we are allowing for process, we also have catches that make sure that equity and justice are, you know, don't get ignored somehow. Now, again, I don't think most traditional bylaws are bad in any way, shape, or form, but it just struck me just because my radar is on how, when left to our own devices, we're not very good.
So some of that,
I see when there are decisions to make, some sort of statement that says when there are decisions to make, A, they will use catalytic thinking, and B, there will be an emphasis on asking those questions. The question that pops to my mind at the moment is, in this situation, what does inclusion look like? What does equity look like? In the, what will this decision make possible, and what does equity look like in this decision? I love it. Angie, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just gonna, it goes along with that. I think like the bylaws can have clarification about not only, the purpose of the organization, but also the values and sort of maybe, key tenets that we want to promote, that we could address these issues, I think, or frame them. And I guess just to build on what you're saying before, I think one of the questions I've been thinking about is around, it seems to me the sort of traditional bylaws are about assuming the worst in people and just trying to figure out ways to, what do we do when there's a problem? And so if we think about how can we create bylaws that assume the best in people, or will bring out the best in people, then that language would be very different, as well as how we talk about these things in the bylaws, seems to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the do list, not the don't list.
Yeah.
Sounds like we're talking about an HR manual, which is all about what's bad about us.
Yeah. So, but I think we're going down the path of, then it sounds like having this be a one page or a very short document, so that seems to me will also help to engage people, because it will be easier, more quickly for them to see what we're about and what we're doing. And then communicating just the key aspects that we've been talking about. Are there other things that we should be thinking about? Or I guess the question I'm wondering about is, if we're thinking about the board as everyone who's involved in the organization potentially, then how can we create on bylaws that reflect that? So in other words, and how do we proceed here to get to some bylaws where we're having a discussion now, but maybe engaging other people ultimately before we get to a final product?
I'm not sure that I would say the board is everyone. More that decisions are made by everyone. I think there is a legal who is the board. Which is different than who gets to decide stuff. And the who gets to decide stuff is everybody who is involved, everybody who is affected, everybody who shows up. The board, though, I think is a legal thing. I think there's actually something legal, something that they actually said that was actually a legal thing.
Right, so that's a good, maybe unpack this a little bit. Like, so are we saying that who gets to be on the board then? I guess, how do we decide who gets to be on the board if some people that are participating are on the board and some people aren't, but everybody gets to decide? What would be our process then for ultimately selecting board members and terms? Like, for example, it could be possible that every year anyone who's kind of engaged with Creative Future, we say, would you like to be on the board? Yes or no? Yes, you're on the board. No, you're not on the board. Every year we change the board, or something like that. It could be, or it could be even a rotating, ongoing there's no requirement that there be certain terms.
Well, I think it also then brings up what exactly, with the question that we've been at for a while. It's like, what exactly is the board and what do they do? Do they just exist, which is totally fine by me, so that we can point and say, yeah, look, we got some people here.
Well, isn't the board,
Do you want to hear, Lenny?
I'm thinking of this in my many years of being on boards, that, you know, part of the board is continuity of the organization, whatever that means, and ensuring that, and also, you know, when something needs to be signed, you know, I'm going down to, and I'm getting an account at Office Depot for Creating the Future, or a credit card for Creating the Future, whatever. There, you know, the outside world requires that there be a board member or some authorized person, and they need to be authorized through a board to sign that, or to say yay or nay, or to do whatever. So they become sort of the legal agent for the entity. And at some point, there's that interface between the existing world and what we're creating here. And part of that interface is the legal entity. What is the legal entity? And so, I mean, I don't have an answer to that, but it's just making me realize that that's one of the things that needs to be addressed and needs to be here, is that, you know, the board members are kind of champions of the organization. They don't necessarily have to be doing anything in the organization, but they need to be, you know, pro the organization and willing to do whatever legal things are required. Sign the tax return, for example.
The whole thing about being champions for, and the connection to, and the continuity of, is required, not legally, but the system that we currently have, that hierarchical system, requires that. Building an ecosystem, everybody is a champion and everybody is ensuring the continuity of the organization. So if you're building an ecosystem that supports people who are doing whatever projects they're doing and programs they're doing, then, I mean, certainly, as we've talked about, we don't need a CEO. Nobody needs to lead that. It is who is in charge of connecting and supporting and et cetera. But what's striking me, Dimitri, is the legal agents for the entity. I'm just sort of, I mean, inside there's this little giddy kid who's going, could it be that that's all it is? I mean, it could be that this is just, we've got 3 people who are legally okay to sign stuff. Legally can bind the organization because it is still a corporation. I mean, as simple as that.
So there's a couple things going through my head. One is, you know, Hildy, when we had the meeting, why am I blanking on the woman we met with, the attorney?
Ellis.
Alice, thank you. One of the things she said is that the board can designate authority upon one, which is, to Dimitri's point, that's what happens, is you basically say the CEO can sign off on everything. You know, that's what it does. So it sort of speaks to me that there isn't, and again, it needs to be held by, there isn't a function that the people have to actually do. And again, I'm just going off the 3 because that's the, you know, the IRS won't sneeze at us if we have 3. But the other thing that was going through my head, so I've been spending so much time working with people in boards saying, you've got to think about your board as an asset. How is it bringing beneficial value? Because you're investing resources into it, so you need some return on that investment. And some of the things that you were talking about, Dimitri, I was like, that, yeah, those are the types of things. But then I have this other parallel conversation going on saying, why is any of that actually in the capacity of the board? That's just organizational capacity. It just has to happen somewhere. And really, the board's only job is to make sure it's the delegation. It's only to make sure that it's happening, unless we choose the board to be something else. But since we're talking about stripping it down, like I almost am moving away. I'm like, okay, we're no longer asking the board to be an asset, meaning we're not actually asking this group of 3 people to do anything of added benefit to the organization for all intents and purposes. We're designating that out into the nodes, hubs, and the whatever forum comes up there. So then what are we left with? Again, I know we keep coming back to this, but I keep coming back to, like, it's like a group of people who meet every, the once a year board meeting to basically say, is the capacity there to do what we need to do? Like, that's all they do, is they don't provide any capacity whatsoever. They just are checking, like, did we meet legal requirements, whatever they were for the corporation? And do we trust that the capacity necessary to continue to move the organization forward exists with integrity? Whatever that, but like, because I was trying to think functionally, what would this board do? And I feel like it's just, that's it. It's sort of, it really is this body that just asks that question. And we're asking nothing more of them in terms of providing a new capacity for the operational elements of the organization, which is really weird.
My brain, Justin, you just like, oh God, dynamite just went off. Thanks a lot. So what we had said 6 months ago or so, when we came to the whole thing about the board being the insurers that we are walking our talk, the body that is ensuring that we're doing our work with integrity, that we're meeting the expectations that people have of us. Riffing off of what you just said, that also doesn't need to be the board. We need a system for asking people what their expectations are and reporting out that we are meeting those expectations with integrity, but it doesn't need to be the board. So what we had been, what my brain had been stuck on when we came to that was, okay, how's that going to happen? And how is this body that meets, even if they meet once a month, even if they meet for 10 hours a month as volunteers, which they're not gonna, how is that body going to look at all of the stuff that happens throughout an organization and check? I mean, it just seemed unwieldy to me. But if, in fact, for every decision made by whomever it is made, that decision-making process is documented and strategy meetings are all held openly so that, just like we do now, then you've got a part in the website basically that says here's decisions that have been made, and here's how they were made, and here's and it's a form, it's a tick box that people fill out when they're making decisions. These are the questions. That's sort of where my brain is going, is that this can be mechanized. It does not need to be the board that does that piece of it, the holding of integrity. If we have, what we need is a system for it. It doesn't need to be the board. And I'm just deeply agreeing with everything that you just said, Justin. Yeah. We were trying to find the role for the board, but if and we come back to the board keeps us legal, ensures that the tick boxes are being ticked off, but that's, yeah, I'm liking that it doesn't need to be the board. It just needs to be a system for ensuring that it's there and easily accessible, easily findable. interestingly, as I'm thinking about it, if every decision, so let's say, 5 years from now, this ecosystem there's projects going on all over the place, and they're somehow affiliated with creating the future. Decisions are being made, they're documented, and there's a system where I just, Hildy off the street, not anything to do with creating the future, can go, oh wow, how did they make that decision? And I can click and I can find it. Then that degree of openness and transparency and accessibility of the information, it doesn't need to be the boards at all.
Right, and so in this case, it doesn't really matter who's on the board in a way. It could be people just rotating, so they have different people come on to do that kind of checkbox role. As a different way to engage someone, but maybe there's a way to use it for some kind of capacity building. But
and then if we want to monthly have community meetings where whatever issues are coming up, they're community meetings, that brings it back down to the way people actually gather and make decisions when they're not structured as an organization. We come together. I mean, I'm looking at my neighborhood. Once a month, a whole bunch of people get together. They make decisions about the neighborhood, about some project that they might want to do. But it's not left up to 4 people or 10 people. It's people gather together in community, and maybe we just do that. I can see the wheels in your head turning, Vu. Tell me what's going on in your brain.
Well, one, I'm wondering where you got that embroidered "Creating the Future" shirt, because I think.
yeah, nice.
I don't know. I don't process very well immediately, so I need probably time to think about this. I'm just thinking a lot about what RBC has been doing and has, the decision making is kind of interconnected with sort of the board model that we have. Because the community meetings, I think they're great, but sometimes when there's too many people, do we make a decision by consensus? Because then that will take forever, and people are oftentimes not happy at all, and it does slow things down. When I left REC, it has been exploring this sort of, again, this advice process model that we got from Reinventing Organization, which is kind of like this in between this hierarchical model of making decision and the consensus model. And there's like a sort of a third axis to that, which is whoever is most aligned with the issue makes the decision, as long as they check in with everyone who will be affected by it. And it has been I think it has been interesting. And I'm just thinking maybe we should consider like looking at this book. There's an illustrated model, an illustrated book that's much shorter than the 360 pages. The RBC team started having a book club where they read the book and started discussing each chapter. And I think that was actually very helpful, just to be on the same page, even if people didn't agree on the concepts of things. But I do like the framework that he has, which is that it can't just be one thing anymore. It's like a radical paradigm shift that we're thinking about. So it's not just that we're thinking about how do we shift boards to correct, it's the entire nonprofit structure of doing things. Our nonprofits are related to one another, how we think about leadership and not having it be so hierarchical and patriarchal, and how we do fundraising, because I'm thinking about, all the work you've been doing, Dimitri and Hildy, and if this work's going to move forward, there has to be a way to fund it, because, you've been contributing so much to it. And all these things have to somehow intersect into this sort of holistic body of work. And I don't want us to get too mired into this sort of board thing when we really have to look about this holistic entire thing that we have to.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, are we spending a lot of time on this, and as if we have to make a decision that we can never change ever again. And maybe what we need to do is think about an iterative model where we're like, yeah, you know, this is what we're going to do. And we put into the bylaws, well, look, if we need to make it flexible enough where we can change things as we go along and reiterate as we learn and try more things. Because I am also very concerned about all the other really exciting things around catalytic thinking and that we need. And we've been spending a lot of time discussing the board structure, which I'm very excited about and I'm thinking a lot about. But I also think we also need to kind of get everything to intersect.
I am very much like we are at a point where we could, if sat down, write a page, and it would be the bylaws. I mean, it's feeling very, very like right there. And you're absolutely right, Vu, in that, you know, nothing is unchangeable. And I love the you know, the thought that we revisit it, and we periodically intentionally revisit it. Let's see if I had.
So is this a good time to maybe talk about, you know, one-page bylaws? What do we want to make sure is in there? We've already talked about a few things that are, we talked about the legal minimum, 3 members, and talking in types of decisions, catalytic thinking, process, or maybe having an addendum then that would give an example. Decision making, a way to reflect that we want to keep these things flexible and that we can change them easily.
I just put into the chat box the order of the questions and the types of questions that we ask in catalytic thinking.
So we want to make sure those are reflected in the bylaws. Is there anything else? And maybe it's useful to look at, like, here's a one-pager for this is a feminist club that might, let me see if I can share. So one-page bylaws and constitution for the Hendricks Feminist Club. But you could see, like, they keep things pretty simple. I don't know if we want, you know, this exactly this format, but maybe the spirit of this sort of approach.
I love finance decisions should be left to the discretion of the organization as a whole.
They don't, I guess they don't have a board section because they're actually a club of a
Club, yeah.
university.
I do like it, except that it's very specific, like officers will be elected in May. I just say officers will be elected at discretion of the board.
Everything is at the discretion of the organization.
Well, if you've got 3 people electing officers, it's going to be interesting.
Well, and the officers don't actually have to be the board. That's
right.
Not. That's a whole different compliance component. You know, it's interesting. I was thinking about Vu's point around, you know, nothing is cast in stone. Was if we actually think about the bylaws as a portal, almost like a landing page. Like, here's the document that has all that, you know, regulatory stuff in it. Like that, if you click here, if you want to know where we live, you know, all of that stuff. And then, you know, the thing that says, you know, I do like in that. something around things being left to the discretion of, but I think we need to define discretion, which I think we do with catalytic thinking. But I feel like if we can point people, it's sort of that whole idea that I was introduced to with bylaws is like they should say as little as possible and as much should be put in policies, because policies you can change and bylaws you can, but they're more difficult to change. So if we just keep pointing it to it, like, look here for all those people. You know, I think we do have to say something declarative around who the board is.
Yeah.
Just, you know, and if it is, I mean, I kind of like Angie's idea of like, if we have this rotating body of people who have volunteered to, you know, check these things on an annual basis. that is our board. And I think actually is interesting is, to Dimitri's point, we've actually taken organizational continuity off the table. Because that's one of the big things with the boards is like they have to be the keepers of whatever. Which is why term limits was always an issue, was you don't want the same people being the caretakers, because then you get the bias. Whereas if we're saying the board does this, oh, and if you care about any of the other decision-making stuff, go look here about how the organization is structured in terms of, you know, and that gives the opportunity to drive the hub and network and catalytic decision making. But I mean, literally, like I could see that statement, like, you want to know organizational structure, click here. You want to know, you know, what the board does, they review these things. And here are the questions they ask every year. Click here to see those questions. It's almost a table of contents. And I think it would be kind of fun to think about that question of like, what is it that people actually end up going to the bylaws for? And we figure out how to answer that question. You know, so how many people are on the board? Well, you know, go look at this document about how we talk about recruiting leadership for an organization, or, you know, like, it just seems like we sort of leave ourselves really wide open to say, oh, you got a question? Here, go see how actually did it, as opposed to a prescription of this is how we do it.
It's like a Wikipedia for the board, where you have a question, this is the part that answers that question. If this is what
A wiki.
A wiki for the board.
So can I go, I have two thoughts. I wanted to hear what you guys think. So on the one hand, to keep things simple, we can say left to the discretion of the board, but then we're also saying the decisions are made by the key people involved in the organization. I don't know how to talk about this. Are we talking, and that's the second question, do we talk about people who are involved in the organization as members?
That actually has a legal definition.
Well, in this bylaw of the third waivers, they say members are open to anyone who attended at least one meeting. So then who, when we say discretion of the board, we really mean discretion of the organizational participants.
So here's a thought that just occurred to me as you were talking, Angie. Bylaws as they normally exist refer to boards because they assume that the board in that hierarchical organization is the one that makes decisions. That's why they refer to boards. Right. So why do we have to spend so much time talking about boards in the bylaws when the board is not the one making the decisions? The people closest to the decision are making the decisions. So if that's what we really care about, is who's making decisions and how are they made, that's really what the bylaws will address. rather than spending a whole hell of a lot of time on what the board is. If that's not what the board does. It just suddenly occurred to me, why do we care about the board in the first place? Because they're the ones making the
Yeah.
decisions. So now they're not. And we get to say, here's who gets to make decisions. And it's, I threw together just an outline that was occurring to me as we were talking. One of the things the bylaws want to know is how are decisions made? Who gets to make them? The people closest to the decision, the people who are impacted by it, affected by it. How will it be made? Asking the questions of catalytic thinking. And that's it. I mean, in terms of, you know, do people go because they want to know who's legally liable? The corporation is legally liable, and unless there is gross negligence, boards in all 50 states are not personally liable for anything, unless they've really screwed up. And maybe we just have one sentence that says, we won't really screw up.
Yeah. We assume the best in people. I think that's a good point. We don't have to, the bylaws do not have to include any information about the board, actually. There's nothing that's required actually be included in the bylaws.
Right, and if we think the board is irrelevant, then why are we spending so much time? I'm sort of ripping up a Boone's point. Why are we spending so much time on it? We're back to drawing a fish.
Yeah, good. All right, let's move on then. So we're going to include in the bylaws your bullet points I'm seeing here. So what the legal stuff, what do you mean by that?
You know, anything that is legally, that we think people would want to, and again, I'm coming back to, if we were to post our bylaws at the site, and they actually had meaning to somebody looking at it. What is some of the legal boilerplate stuff that people want to know? So, you know, Dustin had mentioned before some things like, you know, where is it located? You know, some of those minor sorts of things, you know, when is your fiscal year? Like, who freaking cares? But
yeah, we don't actually need to.
If we decide that there's anything, that they go in a separate section that is just bullet pointed. Rather than spending lots of time on them, but I'm.
Okay, sounds good to me. What else do we need to talk about or think about in order to kind of go off and draft these things?
I'm feeling good.
So then next steps, drafting these things. I committed to doing this earlier. I just ran out of time but I also, clearly I wasn't quite sure what I should do when I was started to think about it too. So now I feel like I have a better idea of that. So I could try to take a stab at drafting to share with everyone. So if that's all so are there other items that we want to discuss today about this topic or some other topic?
Well, it does raise the question of our meeting. Is there a reason for us to meet every month from this point forward? You know, we can adopt the bylaws, we can, you know, that's great. Is there a purpose for meeting? Who's going to be on the board? Who will be, you know, those kinds of.
Can the meetings be, as opposed to a board meeting, meetings, there are probably meetings that need to be organized around issues, right? Like program planning or fundraising or that kind of thing. Which would be open to anyone who's interested and willing to work on it, just like with communication strategy meetings you guys have.
So I think to Vu's point earlier, which is, the shift then becomes to community meetings,
Mhm.
whatever this community entity is that's looking to shape different issues that the organization is facing. And again, that's where we're looking to bring in people who have the curiosity, competency to sort of engage with whatever that realm is, or it is something like, acquiring assets and resources. I won't even use the term.
Yeah.
If it is, again, I mean, I know you've had these conversations with different kinds of groups, but what we take that is, it's not a monthly board meeting, but it is then it's just a question of, is there a structure that the organization needs of regularness to address some issues? And then we sort of convene around what that is to bring that capacity to bear. We sort of meet as a board because we're trying to figure out what this board is. And if we just figured it out, then we just worked ourselves out of jobs.
Well, yeah, because the past several years, we've been trying to figure out what the organization would look like, structurally, the entire thing. We figured that out. We figured out what the board would look like inside of that. And the big piece that I'm looking at, grab pieces of paper, the big piece that I'm looking at over the next couple of years is building out what we said we were going to do. Building out this ecosystem and resourcing that, which and the steps towards that, shifting, for example, from if we are an ecosystem that is supporting people who are using catalytic thinking and bringing our mission forward. And our purpose is, the organization's purpose is that ecosystem, is sort of the thing that supports all of that. What are the pieces that need to be in place? How do those get into place? How do we staff? How do we scale? Those kinds of things. That's the big question over the next several years. In some of what's happening, for example, is a shift in focus from what we were at startup to what we are now, which is we were primarily teaching classes. And if we are going to be the system that supports, we don't need to be the ones teaching the classes. Having the information available so that a nonprofit resource center or an academic institution can teach the classes. We provide the content. We may do some train the trainer, but there again, it becomes more fractal. It becomes more distributed. I don't know why I'm babbling all about it, but it is. I mean, that is sort of what's next. But it is what the work we've done over the past several years is to get us to that point where we understand what that looks like and can make that transition. And this is a beautiful final piece in that. I think the thing that excites me about it, one of the things that excites me about it, in addition to the way things have been, do not need to be the way they are going forward for anybody, is so many of us make the assumptions that we're doing things because they're legally required. And truly, the several months that Justin and I spent talking to experts over and over and over again, and the more reading you're doing, Justin, and feeding back into that, it's just not true. And the fact that even within this legal structure of a corporation, we can do whatever the hell we want. That is just freeing and exciting. And we'll experiment. And if this needs to be tweaked, we'll come together and we'll tweak it. It just feels really right.
Yeah, Justin, when you were talking about,
And because
Oops, sorry.
I had the same sort of gut feeling. Something needs to continue here. You know, I mean, how do we feed this, energize this? You know, board meeting was how we did it, or what we thought how we should do it. But it's one of the ways. And you know, I keep envisioning in my mind the search for the Holy Grail moment, when the have faith moment, where Indiana Jones is going to cross the chasm, and it looks like there's nothing but a drop to his death, but there really isn't. And with a throw of sand, he shows the way to everybody else so they can also cross that chasm. And I kind of feel we're kind of at that moment where we know that there is a path forward. We know that there is a way of energizing people. We know, and it isn't necessarily a bridge like the board. It is a path. And so I know now I'm babbling, but I've been sort of, when you said that, Justin, it kind of hit a chord in me as to, yes, I'm feeling that too. What does that mean? And how do we address that while creating this amazing new thing? So I just wanted to express I think I'm on the same page with you on that, or at least emotionally feeling something similar. And I'm excited to see what comes from that.
So what is there a role for us to be playing around different strategy areas, or helping to think about structure or whatever?
Let's do this. I am not going to be here for our next board meeting. I will actually be in Orlando. I am so excited about this. I am keynoting an event alongside 3 other keynotes. One is Edgar Villanueva, one is Gene Case, and one is the National Geographic photographer Christina Mittermeier. I am so excited to just be in a room with all those people. So that is where I will be on March 9th. What I'm wondering is if we skip a month, gives us 2 months to pull together bylaws. At the next meeting, April, we can look at the bylaws, tweak the bylaws. We won't have to tweak them. We'll have been all working on them together anyway. We can bless them, and also that will give me time to bring us all up to speed on what the plan is going forward for building out this ecosystem, because we do have a plan, and several key steps in it, with some interim resourcing steps rooted in collective enoughness. And so that's sort of what I'm thinking. And we can then talk about what the plans are and what ideas are, and you know, just sort of bounce some things around in terms of what's going on with that. And I think, Dimitri, your Indiana Jones leap of faith feels right, in that I think we just are going to need some time to try it on and see what happens. But let's give ourselves the time to write the bylaws, look at them, say a novena over them, and post them to the website, and move on from that, and then to just, you know, catch up on what is all the stuff and where we're heading. Does that sound like a plan?
Yeah.
Okay.
So any other thoughts anyone has? Should we move into our kind of final reflections for the meeting today? Unless anyone wants to talk about anything else. Okay, so what are your kind of main takeaways from the meeting today? Final reflections?
Well,
Anybody
I want
wanna
to dive
start?
in with one. Angie, you
All
are
right.
up. I am
Thank you.
I'm reveling in your running the meeting, and so that's off the top of my mind.
I'm trying to channel you, Hildy. I don't know, doing my best. Thank you.
You're channeling Angie, and I'm appreciating that.
Okay, what else? I will say that this whole thing about boards and what they should do. I wrote to myself that I want to do a research paper to figure out the origins of where this all started. Now that and the social construction about the role of boards, I think there's a good paper to be had there. And also, like, I got to totally rethink, how I teach my classes. But anyway, I got to just change my life completely now.
Right, then my work here is done.
So I'll actually share, there was an article in the Washington Post, maybe a couple weeks ago, which was actually, I don't think I shared it out with people. It was, why do we need boards? It was actually in response to the whole bereavement thing. But it was sort of raising this question because everyone was asking, like, what does a board member do? And of course, there was no answer. I mean, the article basically said there was no answer. So good luck, Angie, on that potential. But what really I echo is this idea of rethinking, because when people ask about boards, and I mean, that a lot of my space is working with organizations and sort of trying to back them into, my idea, which is the board is just a construct. So however you construct it, that's going to really, you want it to reflect the needs of the organization. And again, I always come at it from that, whatever it is, it needs to be an asset, not a liability. And it's interesting to have gone the full extreme of it, which is to say, like, what happens when you strip all functionality out of the board, except for this basic compliance integrity piece. And it poses a really interesting question of just, like how you kind of reconcile that. And I totally believe it. I think it's very doable. And it's just interesting to live in this world. Again, I go back to Angie, what you were saying, which is trying to work with people when they're in no uncertain terms saying, what's the best practice to me? Asking me, like, come tell us, and I'm sitting there going, I don't answer other than it depends. And sort of having this as an example of, this is how far you could go. Literally, you could go this far and you're left with all of the capacity of the organization is in the organization. It's not no longer this notion that there's this separate board entity that has some mysterious capacity, or that we dump. I mean, I've said it in this group, my idea that the board as it stands is a, what is it that I use? The potpourri of a hodgepodge of responsibilities, serviced by a hodgepodge of people. I mean, so that's sort of where I am with this. Is, I mean, some of it's almost like, oh, I've taken my own rhetoric to the far extreme. I'm not sure I'm quite comfortable with it yet.
I'm a horrible enabler.
Hi everyone. I I'm really excited about where we're going with this. I think the field is just really anxious right now. I've been traveling all over the world, and this is clearly a system that does not work. It makes no sense. So I think people are really excited. I mentioned creating the future a while ago on the drawing the new fish blog post I wrote about, and people are very curious. If you don't mind, I'm just going to continue reflecting on there and just saying that we're thinking of things.
Please.
We don't have the solution already completely set out, but I think giving the field permission to explore things is critical. And so the fact that we're talking about this and saying, hey, it's okay. You don't have to do things the same way. We haven't figured it out either, but we're going to try to. I think that is really critical for the field to be able to do. I heard that the board model was actually, it came over from the UK.
Yeah.
Maybe the program brought it over or something. Like, why are we using a system that was brought over hundreds of years ago? So it makes no sense. So let's change it.
The US has a habit of sticking to systems that are hundreds of years old.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh.
Good answer.
Yes. Why don't we use the metric system? It's ridiculous.
If they're going to bring something over, let's bring that.
Why don't we call this the metric system of boards?
Okay.
Yeah, oh man.
That's great. Yeah, that's great.
Dimitri, what about you?
Yeah.
Let me
Yeah.
take you off there.
This is a really interesting moment for me. My first encounter with boards was when I was 22, which was a long time ago. And it was in the labor union that I was involved with. And the board was basically an entity designed to control power and to exercise an entity of power that could exercise control. And maintaining control of that board was the most critical thing to many, many parties who were battling each other. And it was something that this is the antithesis of. So I'm sort of reflecting that in my work lifetime, I have been involved in many boards, the first of which was the most contentious board I have ever been involved with, where there was so much political stuff going on, all to control the power of a little 200-person organization. And it is very, very interesting to be at this point of saying, wait a minute, this is not about power, and this is not about control. This is about values, and this is about setting standards. So I'm really at a kind of an interesting internal transition point. I believe in all of this. I've devoted my life to all of this, but also to be at the point of saying, okay, here's the one pager. This is what it is, which is so far removed from where that was in 1973. So that's my reflection.
Wow.
Wow. Wow. Huge.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. I've got several thoughts that are coming up. The primary one is that this just feels right. I mean, I'm feeling this immense calm. It just feels right. I love you sharing the exploration book. Absolutely, please do. I am hoping to write, about a year and a half ago, maybe a little bit longer, I did a first draft of a white paper on what our board was doing in terms of the organizational structure part. And at the end was like, oh yeah, and the board's going to figure something out. I'm now looking forward to finishing that and getting it out there. I'm hoping that we can get it published broadly to just encourage people to ask different questions. I was smiling, Justin, when you were talking about the fact that people want the best practice and they want the answer. For easily a decade, back in the day when I was still teaching board workshops, when I was still consulting, the freedom that came when I realized I didn't have to give them an answer. My answer could always be, that sounds like a great question to discuss with your board. And the fact that we've got this, please just hand me the answer, when, and on the other side, boards who do meet are seriously disengaged generally with each other. They're generally, just let me out of here, this is so boring, I could die. Where if they actually had those conversations, they'd be interested and they'd be engaged. And so I'm just loving living inside the questions right now. And that living inside the questions and making the assumption we don't have to do anything. What would we build? It just feels really right. And I do have immense faith that we'll figure out from here what is next and what needs to be talked about, what doesn't need to be talked about, and etc. But this just feels, it just feels right. So thank you guys. And Carl, we missed you. Definitely.
Yeah, Carl, we just got rid of your job. No.
we can't get, you see, here's why we can't get rid of the board, is because Carl has consistently said that this board is his me time, and I don't want to take that from him. So, so we have to stay around.
We have to just get together, talk to each other. We could start a book club. And
there we go. No. There we go. And I do have an answer to Boo's question, which is Aramark. Dimitri and I got shirts.
Yeah, I was going to ask you your size. So,
yeah.
Medium.
Awesome.
Is that counting board compensation? Because we might have a policy about that in our bylaws.
Board compensation, yeah, we get paid in shirts. Yeah, like everything else around here, Dimitri and I bought these. This is awesome. Just thanks, guys. This is a delight.
Yeah, thank you. So to follow up, then I'm going to work on drafting bylaws. Will you, Hildy or Dimitri or somebody else, want to email everybody about or I guess Carl is who we need to email about our meeting being canceled?
Yes. Yeah, I'll do that. I will do that.
Thank you. And yeah. Anything else that we need to do for the good of the order or make sure we're clear on next steps?
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of the
day.
day.
To the gym and start writing, according to Boo.
Yeah.
Yes, you do. Yes, you do. Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you all. And Andrew, thank you. This was awesome.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank
See you guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.